to welcome to the stage Minister Shanmugam, who is the Home Affairs Minister and Minister for Law in Singapore. He was previously the Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's had a long and distinguished career as a cabinet. He first became a cabinet minister in Singapore in 2008. And let's dive right in, sir. Since the subject of this conference is disinformation, it is very timely that Singapore has just passed a law this month, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Bill. So what is that intended to do? Why now? If you could explain a little bit about what you're doing in this area, sir.
Thank you, Peter. What is it? It can be described in very simple terms. When there is a falsehood put out which affects public interest. For example, such and such a bank is going to face bankruptcy, or X number of police officers raped this young woman. You know, this sort of thing that people put out. And if it affects confidence in institutions, we can ask for that to be corrected with that means the original falsehood stays up, but with a note which says, for the true facts, go to such and such a place, and a link. If the person who is subject to the correction notice feels unhappy, he can go to court, and the court is required to make a ruling. I mean, the time frame is such that it can be done within 9 days without cost, and the court decides. First decision is by the executive for the notice. It's subject to review by the courts if there is a challenge. In more serious cases where you think there can be violence, serious unrest, can require the falsehood to be taken down. So that's in broad terms. It's primarily civil, but if a person intentionally puts it out, a falsehood, intending for it to be damaging to society, he can be charged, but that's got to go under the normal criminal laws and has got to be proven beyond reasonable doubt, including the mental element. Yeah. Why now? If you want, I can give you an answer. Otherwise, why now? It's a slightly more, if I can give a slightly more philosophical answer. If you look at society today, you have governments, you have institutions, bar council, the church, whatever, various institutions which mediate between people and governments. And there are national conversations that go on as to who should be elected, what the state of the institutions ought to be, what sort of changes you ought to have in society. And those conversations are mediated by the media. Underlying these national conversations is what I would call, what people have called the infrastructure of facts. Certain facts, basic things about societies that we all take as given, take as true. When they are not true, of course, the media's role is to expose them, but primarily you accept that the police are employed by and work for the state rather than for another state, stuff like that. Today, falsehoods have been weaponized to attack that basic infrastructure of fact and make people question on fundamental basic facts, which then prevents a proper national conversations of the sort we used to have in many societies and which underpins democracies. So if you don't deal with it, I think democratic societies, any kind of civilized society that's organized along these lines, would be under severe stress.
And what are the penalties for people who don't accept your corrections, or how does that work? My understanding is there are fines and potentially prison terms.
The starting point is when you're required to put up a notice, you carry your original article. So in that sense, there is no censorship. You carry a line which says, this is disagreed with. There is a suggestion this is untrue. If for the true facts, go to such and such a place. You put it up, let people judge for themselves, whether they believe the correction or they believe your. If you refuse, your remedy under the law is you put it up and then go to court and get it corrected within 9 days. If the government is wrong, it gets cancelled. But if you refuse in the first place, that's an offense. Yeah. And I mean, penalties are set out. I don't, it's a range of penalties, fines included.
And you've already started this process? I mean, already correction notices have gone up?
Well, correction notices haven't been issued. The law is in force.
Right.
You need to show that there is a falsehood and that it affects public interest. Falsehood per se doesn't come under the Act.
And who determines what is true? That's a sort of philosophical
Well,
question.
unless you're saying we are in a post-truth situation where your truth is different from my truth, certain things, either some things happened or some things didn't happen. Either, that video of Notre Dame burning, with somebody saying an American senator has said that this is just desserts for their anti-Islamic viewpoints. Either that is true or that's not true. And in the first place, because of the speed with which these things happen, the executive decides, but as I said, within 9 days you can have it in court.
And did you work with the social media companies on this issue, and to what extent have they received this well, badly?
I don't think it'll be too much to say they have received it well, but it's also not accurate to say they received it badly. They would, of course, prefer that we didn't go down this route. They would prefer what they consider to be self-regulation. We have seen it repeatedly fail in many places. We've told them that we consider them our partners and we work with them, and they know we are a responsible government, and we're sort of taking the journey together.
Did you learn from other countries and kind of their experience, I mean, in this area about what to do or what the problems are?
We have been looking at it very seriously, both in terms of the problems and the way falsehoods have been weaponized to attack other countries. Famous examples come from your presidential elections. Without saying this country or that country was responsible, we know what happened at Brexit. We know what happened with the French presidential elections. But even outside of the elections, today, it's a very open thing. There is something called the Gerasimov Doctrine, named after the Russian military chief of staff. That is, every population has what is termed a protest potential, a set of faults within society which can be exploited to make them unhappy and angry and turn against one part of the population to turn against another part, or multiple parts. So that's happened with the same organization outside of the US setting up Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, police versus African Americans. And so enhancing the protest potential, having protests, having people shoot at each other, starting an internet war, as it were, and keeps it bubbling, so the lines between war and peace have been blurred, and you are constantly under attack. This is pretty serious.
Singapore is a racially mixed country, obviously. Is one of your concerns people inciting racial animosity?
That has always been one of our concerns, racial, religious, amongst others.
And who is, to the extent that you can say, the disinformation campaigns that have been waged in Singapore, who is waging them?
We have past examples. We prefer not to talk about current ones. In the past, we have identified attempted influence, Singaporean newspapers paid for by Malaysian politicians, which then campaigned against, for example, our national service, which is a key pillar of our defense. We have closed down a newspaper for being funded from China a long time ago. We have had a number of experiences in the past, but these come from 30 years, 40 years ago. Today, we see all around us, there's clear evidence of influence in Malaysia, Indonesia during elections and outside of elections. We haven't faced the same level of interest by other countries yet, but we don't wait for the problems to come.
You have an election coming up next year. I mean, what are the lessons that you learned from the 2016 U.S. presidential election?
Let me answer a question that you're not asking, which is, I think the political lessons are inequality, how people feel about the system. You know, globalization is great, but the guy who loses a job, globalization is 100% bad. How do you mediate between the different sections of society, the winners and the losers, and make sure that everyone agrees to a common set of goals? I mean, that's, I think, one big lesson that a lot of people are still not learning. But beyond that, specifically in terms of the weaponization of the internet, I think the 2016 American elections offers many lessons. For us, we're doing three things. One, amongst other things, so three things legislatively. One is dealing with falsehoods in the way that we have attempted to do, but make no mistake, that's not a panacea for all the problems that you're going to find. It requires us to identify the falsehoods, put down correction notices immediately, and ensure that those correction notices are seen by people. None of these are easy things to do, number one. Second, specific to racial and religious issues, I just took a legislation through Parliament last week, which updates a 30-year-old law, which is unique in the world again, maintenance of religious harmony. So any cleric who gets into the political arena and makes statements using religion, we can ask him to stop doing it. Keeping religion and politics separate, it applies in some countries. We have got multi-religious societies, so we've got to do these things. Weaponization of religion, using religion for violence between groups, or another thing that's happening is using religion to attack people of certain sexuality. All of these things clearly would be no-go, and we can also move in and stop it on the internet. The third thing would be specifically dealing with foreign interference in domestic politics, primarily now through the internet. That will come up in a couple of months. So we're doing these things, but legislation doesn't create automatically the conditions. You also have to have the resources to deal with these issues.
You mentioned using religion for sort of political purposes. Singapore did have a problem with Jamaat Islamiyah, which is sort of the local affiliate of Al-Qaeda, with a number of ordinary Singaporeans planning to attack a variety of targets in Singapore in this sort of 9/11 period. Do you still have that problem, or is that largely taken care of? Were you surprised that ordinary Singaporeans were being recruited, and did you have an ISIS problem in addition?
We do have a problem. It's no longer a surprise. Every now and then we pick up somebody who wants to go out there and do some bad things to other people. The influence from ISIS may have been defeated physically, but the intellectual influence, the ideas are on the internet. The speakers' videos are accessible in some ways. And some people, when they see these things, they do get self-radicalized. When we pick up people and we analyze, it used to take a year, 2 years for people to get radicalized. Now, sometimes people can get radicalized within a week. And they want to go out there and they want to kill somebody. So it's not, since the defeat of ISIS, the influence has, I think, weakened, but it has not gone away, and we still pick up people.
Do you have a program in Singapore to de-radicalize these people that you pick up, and is it effective?
I think it's effective. We have had a program for some time, which many other countries in the world come and study. And one approach is lock these people up and throw away the keys, which we don't think is a good approach. So we have asked our Muslim community to come forward, because if I or the government talks to them about religion, we have no credibility. It has to come from the community. And the community has got to say what is the right way of practicing Islam, and that these are not the tenets of Islam. And so the community comes up with a syllabus. They do a very intensive one-on-one for sometimes years. And then they tell us this person is now understood. He is de-radicalized. And most of those who were detained have been released. Most people are released within about 18 to 36 months.
And have they exclusively now been radicalized by the internet, or are they meeting people? What is the process for the people?
The primary medium of radicalization is the internet. Generally, the clerics, the system, the teaching of Islam in Singapore, and our link up with friends across the world in getting to the best institutes where Islam is taught has helped to keep a certain moderation and mainstream approach.
Switching gears a bit, Singapore was a former British colony like Hong Kong. What are the lessons are you drawing from what is going on in Hong Kong right now? How do you see it play out?
It's a very difficult situation in Hong Kong. I think the starting point is it's a complex set of factors at play. One, if you are a young person in Hong Kong, in your 20s, 30s, you think in terms of buying something for yourself to live in, it's almost impossible. It's more expensive than London and New York. So a 400 square foot apartment can cost you more than US $1 million. How many people in their 30s can look at that? 400 square foot, people talk in terms of 2 car park lot sizes and 3 car park lot sizes. So when they look at their future, that's one aspect of it. And then they see a system where a few people at the top, in terms of business people, seem to be making extraordinary amounts. And the large number of people who are working don't seem to have that, where is the light at the end of the tunnel? So that's one aspect. The second aspect appears to be ideological. When Hong Kong was handed over from Britain to China in 1997, its GDP was 1/5 of China's GDP. Today, it's less than 3%. There is a change. And Hong Kong's raison d'etre, economic raison d'etre, is China. It's completely dependent on China. I think that creates a certain tension. But also, when you go on the streets and you demonstrate and you break down symbols of the Communist Party and symbols of the state, and you demand one person, one vote, universal franchise, which doesn't happen anywhere else in China. Those young people, some of them, not all of them, who are asking for these things and using violence, is it realistic that the Communist Party of China is going to agree to that? And if you're sitting in Beijing as part of the central core of the Communist Party, you might well think that this is aimed at communist rule in the rest of China. So are they going to allow that? How realistic are these demands? So there's got to be compromise. There's got to be an understanding. I think the economic and social issues need to be dealt with. At the same time, the political demands have to be based on what is doable. And unless they see that, if they keep insisting on the demands and they say they're going to go into violence, which has already happened for weeks and weeks now, to get those demands, any government will have to deal with it. Today, the Hong Kong government has got to deal with it, and they're doing their best. And characterization in terms of these people are democracy, freedom fighters, and these police are brutal, I think these are cardboard sketches, useful for sound bites, but I don't think it goes with a proper analysis.
Singapore has a sort of balance between China and the United States, and it seems to me that over time, you maybe have distanced yourself a little bit from China. But at the end of the day, you're a small city state with these two superpowers. So how do you get that balance right? And how do you assess where U.S.-China relations are right now with the trade talks seemingly kind of stalled slightly?
I think many countries feel that both would like a deep embrace, and question is, how do you embrace both at the same time? Singapore has had a long, very fruitful, very deep relationship with China, and it has, its relationship with the US is well known, including deep economic ties, and American companies make more from Singapore than they do from any other part of Southeast Asia, and thousands are based in Singapore. The point is simple. We've got to make it clear to the Americans and to the Chinese that we are a sovereign state, and we are not there to jump when people tell us to jump. And we make up our minds on what is in our interest, and we believe that it's possible for us to do business with both. And we have, Prime Minister was just in New York for the UN annual meetings, and he made the point. He believes that the US has a role in Asia. At the same time, we have always welcomed China's rise, and in fact were close partners in the early periods when many Chinese officials came to Singapore to look at how some of the things we do can be done and adapted to their own situation. How do we see US and China? China had about 3%, 4% of the world's trade when it went into the WTO. Today it's at about 14%. Any country that gets into the WTO gets with special conditions, some exemptions related to its status. So China had a number of exemptions, number of gifts in favor of China when it came in because of its less than developed status. I think people can fairly say today, with the state of development, some of those privileges should no longer exist, and those should be given up. And those are fair conversations to have. But if the Chinese think that the demands are really there to change the nature of China, for example, the rule of the Communist Party, or to constrain China's technological development, they're not going to agree to that. And no country that can withstand such a request will give in to such a request. So both sides will have to understand this. Anything that the Chinese believe is targeted at the Chinese Communist Party's rule in China is a red line. It's not going to go. Anything that they feel is really an approach to try and constrain the growth of China is not going to be acceptable. At the same time, American businesses and Americans are not going to agree unless they feel that business is on a level playing field. Compromise is possible. Whether compromise is doable to a large extent depends on a number of calculations that are beyond rational logic. It also depends on the American and domestic political situation.
Meaning the Chinese might just wait President Trump out in the hope that he's a one-term president, or meaning what?
Meaning that if the demands are made, which with an eye towards the American elections, either short-term or long-term, or American domestic political opinion, then they may or may not be doable on the other side.
Does the Trump administration risk a global economic slowdown if it continues with this trade war with China? It seems that there's been a little pause here, but the fundamental issues remain between the two countries.
As I said earlier, I think a compromise is possible, but whether it's going to require political will on both sides to do that compromise. I don't know whether you would say it's a Trump administration that risks the slowdown, but when you have these tariff issues, you already see the slowdown in the global economy. All of us are feeling it. So it's there. It's the question of how long more it continues and how deep it's going to get.
There is a difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in their behavior when it comes to China. It's not just the tariff issue, it's also something that comes pretty close to home for you, which is the Trump administration has done a lot more freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. Is that a good thing? Do you think when historians come to write the story of the Trump administration that they'll say the United States, Trump really got one big thing right, even if the tactics weren't always right, which is that he saw that the rise of China was threatening to global order?
I think if historians say the rise of China is a threat to global order, I think that would be a very misguided view of history. Look, China has a 1.3 billion population. Its people are technologically savvy, they are bright people, they are hardworking people. If you look across Southeast Asia, wherever the Chinese are, even when they are 2-3% of the population, they are hardworking, they are economically very successful, and hugely productive. You can't keep these people down. And if you try, you will fail. The real issue here is, I think let me be very direct. For 300 years, the West, 500 years, the West has been absolutely dominant. When Russia was a threat to the US, it was a military competitor. It was not an economic competitor. Nor was it a real competitor in terms of the battle for ideas, I think. When Japan, at one point, you remember the books on Japan as number one, when Japan seemed like a threat, Japan was an economic competitor. It was not a military competitor. But China is very different. Economically, you go to any department store in the US, what is not made in China? And it's an economic competitor, it's a military competitor, and it's got 4 times the population of the US. It is a united country. Its a sense of nationalism is deep, and sense of pride in Chinese history, culture, 5,000 years, is very strong. And attempts to write history along the lines of Trump recognized, or the administration recognized the threat of China, I think it's a very superficial way of looking at it. The reality is the relative power between China and the US is such that China will grow. But that doesn't mean the US will go down. US is immensely capable. The technological resources the US has, the attraction of talent the US has. The best people, the brightest minds still gravitate towards the US, and that's where wealth is. So the US can compete. US just has got to get some of its domestic politics right, and it can compete with anyone, but it has got to accept that it's not going to be the sole and unchallenged country in the world. There are going to be other centers of power, and China will be one of those centers of power, and it's a new modus vivendi that has got to be worked out. If it's not approached in that way, then I think all of us will have some trouble.
You mentioned Gerasimov and the Russian general who talked about sort of essentially unorthodox forms of warfare. There's a Chinese equivalent that you're probably aware of, unrestricted warfare, by 2 Chinese colonels who actually wrote a very interesting book in 1999, essentially saying we can't fight the US directly, but we can use information warfare as one of the tools in our toolkit. And since the theme of this conference is really around that question, I mean, are the Chinese using information warfare against you or other people in the region?
We have no specific evidence of any information warfare that has been used against us, as I said just now. But we see information warfare being used. We can half suspect that's also from commercial sources because much of this is available commercially. But I've said this publicly. We are a small country. The big boys play by their own rules. And there are no angels or devils in this thing. Do I believe that the Americans don't have such capabilities? I'll be naive to believe that. Do I believe that the British don't have such capabilities? Do I believe that the Chinese don't have such capabilities? Do I believe that the Russians don't have such capabilities? Anyone of that size, with those resources, who doesn't develop these capabilities, you'll be naive to believe otherwise. So it's just a question of who you want to be spied on and who you would rather have listening to your conversations. You use an iPhone, you use a Huawei, you use something else. You think people can't, if they want, listen to you? So, to me, it'll be hypocrisy to suggest that this country does it and that country doesn't do it. I think everyone is capable of doing it. The willingness to be identified as doing it varies, but you saw the tapes. You know what the National Security Agency, NSA in the US has done. That doesn't make them bad guys. They will say they're doing it in American security interest. The Chinese will say something similar, but everyone will deny specific instances.
Could you see a day when, I mean, as you were sitting here in Doha, as you know, the blockade here began with essentially information warfare, with false stories that in the Qatari news agency that were attributed to people in the Emirates who were basically saying that the Emir of Qatar had made favorable comments about Iran and Israel, all of which was false. So in Qatar, clearly there's been an experience with this. Could you imagine a day when countries agree to rules of the road when it came to this issue? After all, this is a relatively new form of warfare, although obviously every country is engaged in propaganda. But are there forms of information warfare that are sort of unacceptable and that countries could come to kind of some general consensus that they wouldn't engage in the interference in other countries with this type of information warfare?
Peter, interference in other countries' affairs is as old as setting up the Greek polities. Asking other countries to come and intervene for domestic political reasons, as well as countries intervening in somebody else's affairs to advance their own interests, as old as people having organized themselves in political entities. I don't believe that's going to go away anytime soon. Maybe amongst certain big countries with capabilities, it's, well, if you do it to me, I can do it to you, and we can all equally suffer. Maybe there can be some kind of modus vivendi, because no one will acknowledge it anyway. But I don't see why they will agree with smaller countries, why they should do. And it'll be ideal if we can get it, but I'm not holding my breath.
And finally, just to return to the social media companies and your experience working with them on this issue, I mean, do you have you say they didn't really take it that well, that you were going to impose these correction notices. Are there other things that you're contemplating in this arena? Have they, tell us a little bit about your interactions with them when you told them that this was possible and now that you've actually done it.
Right. I mean, I sort of, summarized it too much. I mean, we discussed with different social media companies, and the responses were varied. Some understood very early on in the process and worked with us. Some were more reluctant and came on board later in the process. But I think what was needed from us was clarity that we will do it. And they know that when Singapore says we will do it, we will do it. Second, we are not a country that will make U-turns, and we are not there to fix them in any way. We want a relationship where everything will be set out in law and something that's workable for them and workable for us and achieves an end objective which is in their interests. Because if people believe that generally what they see is true, and it can be hard-hitting, it can be opinions, it can be different viewpoints, but based on certain basic facts, then it's better for them too. And I think they understood that. It's been a continuing conversation for more than 2 years now.
Well, I want to thank Minister Shanmugam for his very insightful observations. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.